For centuries the spiral appeared only after the world corrected itself. Storms shifted. Rivers changed direction. Systems redistributed pressure. Observers wrote down what had already happened. But now the spiral was visible before it closed. And that meant something humanity had never faced before. For the first time in history, the observers could see the moment of decision before the system reached its breaking point. And the question was no longer who noticed the spiral. The question had become something far more difficult. Who would decide what happened next? In forgotten places, where wind carries memory, where silence watches patiently, justice does not shout. It whispers. And every act leaves an echo. This is Whispers of Reckoning. The spiral on the Pine Ridge archive wall had grown larger than anyone in the room had expected. 10 observers. 10 spiral marks. 10 systems that had noticed the same imbalance within the span of a single day. Rotterdam. Osaka. Hudson Bay. Pine Ridge. Buenos Aires. Indian Ocean. Black Sea. South China Sea. Western Pacific. Central Pacific Communications Network. The curve now stretched across the majority of the planet. Michael Carter stood in front of the map, staring at the outer arc with the same quiet focus he once used when analyzing weather radar inside a cockpit. But this was no storm. This was something far more complicated. Shipping routes. Energy grids. Rail systems. Aviation corridors. Communication networks. All of them intersecting inside the same pattern. Eleanor Hayes leaned against the archive desk, reading the latest messages from the silent network. The observers were beginning to talk to each other. Lena Vermeer in Rotterdam had shared shipping pressure data. Kenji Tanaka in Osaka had uploaded rail system timing logs. Sofia Alvarez had sent updated power grid pressure graphs from Buenos Aires. Captain Arjun Patel was still airborne, sending atmospheric pressure reports from the Indian Ocean corridor. Each message described the same thing. A subtle imbalance. A system behaving slightly differently than expected. And beside each report, the same symbol appeared. A spiral. Eleanor spoke quietly. It is still expanding. Michael nodded. Yes. He pointed to the outer edge of the spiral. But it has not closed yet. Eleanor walked to the map and studied the empty space ahead of the curve. Several regions remained untouched by the pattern. Western North America. Northern Europe. The Eastern Pacific. But one region stood out. A long arc stretching across the center of the United States. Eleanor noticed Michael staring at it. What are you seeing? Michael traced the arc with the tip of his pencil. Pressure corridors. She frowned slightly. Weather? Michael shook his head. Multiple systems overlapping. Air traffic routes. Freight rail networks. Interstate trucking corridors. Energy transmission lines. One of the most complex system intersections on the planet. Eleanor looked again. You think the spiral will pass through here? Michael nodded slowly. It fits the pattern. For centuries the spiral had followed the expansion of human systems. Trade routes. Industrial infrastructure. Global transportation. Now it appeared to be approaching one of the largest logistical networks in the world. Eleanor crossed her arms thoughtfully. If the spiral reaches that region. Michael finished the thought. The redistribution could affect several systems at once. For the first time since the spiral had become visible, Eleanor felt a quiet sense of urgency. Not fear. But awareness. The spiral was not merely an abstract pattern. It represented moments when pressure across systems became large enough to force change. She looked toward the stranger standing near the window. You knew this would happen. The man nodded once. Eventually. Michael turned toward him. You called this the moment when observers begin to see the spiral. Yes. Michael gestured toward the map. So this is the moment of decision. The stranger considered the words carefully. Then he answered. It is the beginning of that moment. Eleanor looked back toward the spiral. For centuries observers could only record what had already happened. Michael nodded. But now we might see the final imbalance before it peaks. Eleanor turned toward the desk. Which means the network might influence what happens. The stranger did not immediately respond. Instead he asked a question. What happens when a system reaches its limit? Michael answered automatically. Pressure redistributes. The stranger nodded. And what determines how that redistribution occurs? Michael thought about that. Weather systems responded to pressure gradients. Energy grids balanced supply and demand. Transportation networks rerouted traffic when corridors became overloaded. The answer was always the same. Decisions. The stranger smiled faintly. Exactly. Eleanor felt the weight of the realization settling across the room. The spiral was not simply a natural pattern. It was the record of moments when human decisions intersected with system pressure. Moments when someone noticed imbalance and chose differently. Michael walked slowly back toward the map. If the spiral continues along this arc. He paused. Then the next observer will appear somewhere along this line. Eleanor looked where he pointed. A nearly straight corridor cutting across the continent. For the first time since the spiral had begun forming, the curve looked almost like something else. Not just a spiral. A boundary. A line. Michael spoke quietly. The decision line. The stranger nodded. Yes. Eleanor looked toward him. You have seen this before. The stranger did not answer immediately. Instead he asked another question. Have you noticed what happens when a spiral closes? Michael thought about the historical records. Storms divided. Floods diverted. Systems corrected themselves. Balance returned. He nodded. Yes. The stranger looked toward the outer arc again. And what happens if observers see the spiral before it closes? Eleanor understood immediately. They can influence the decision. The stranger's voice remained calm. That is why the moment matters. The archive phone rang again. Michael answered. Pine Ridge Archive. A familiar voice spoke on the other end. Lena Vermeer. Michael, she said quickly, shipping routes across the North Atlantic just changed again. Michael looked toward the map. Where? Lena answered. Along the exact corridor you predicted. Eleanor walked quickly to the wall. The spiral arc was now pointing directly toward the decision line. Michael spoke quietly into the phone. Did the captain report anything unusual? Lena hesitated. Yes. Michael waited. What did he say? Lena answered softly. He said the pressure in the corridor felt wrong. Michael looked toward the stranger. The man gave a slight nod. Another observer had appeared along the decision line. Drawn through the central United States no longer felt hypothetical. It had become a corridor. A pressure path. A place where multiple systems were beginning to converge. Shipping reroutes. Aviation adjustments. Power fluctuations. Rail timing anomalies. Communications instability. All of them arcing toward the same broad region. The stranger stood near the archive window, silent as always, but even his silence felt more focused now. As if the room had passed some invisible threshold. Michael placed the receiver down gently. He was right. Eleanor did not look away from the map. He usually is. Michael stepped closer to the wall and traced the broad arc again. The decision line was not a single road, not a single city, not a single weather front. It was a corridor of pressure moving across overlapping systems. It crossed air routes, freight corridors, energy transmission zones, data routes, storm bands. The more Michael looked at it, the more it resembled the kind of atmospheric setup pilots fear most. Not because it guarantees disaster. Because it creates the possibility of multiple failures interacting at once. He spoke quietly. If this line activates fully, the redistribution will not belong to one system. Eleanor turned toward him. You mean weather plus infrastructure? Michael nodded. And transportation. And communications. And power. The stranger added one more word. Choice. Eleanor folded her arms. That is the part we still do not understand. The stranger stepped away from the window and approached the map. For centuries observers noticed the spiral only after a decision had already been made. A navigator had changed heading. An engineer had halted work. A pilot had requested a deviation. A train controller had stopped a departure. Only after those moments did the spiral become visible in the record. But now the order had changed. The network was seeing the pressure before the deciding act. Which meant something had shifted in the relationship between attention and imbalance. Michael looked toward him. Are you saying the network itself made the spiral easier to see? The stranger nodded. Yes. Eleanor frowned slightly. Because many observers are connected. Yes. Michael thought about that carefully. In aviation, one isolated weather report means caution. 10 matching reports across a corridor means pattern. Attention did not create turbulence, but it changed how pilots responded to it. Perhaps the spiral worked the same way. He walked to the desk, opened his notebook, and began drawing a new sketch. Not a spiral this time. A line. Then he marked the systems crossing it. Air. Rail. Power. Freight. Storm. Communications. Eleanor watched him. What are you doing? Trying to understand what kind of decision this line is waiting for. The words seemed strange the moment he said them, but not incorrect. Because every historical spiral event, no matter how large the system, had eventually narrowed into one human moment. A small decision inside a larger pressure field. Eleanor moved beside him. If the line is this broad, then the decision could happen in any one of those systems. Michael nodded. Or in several. The stranger spoke quietly. That is what makes this moment different. Eleanor looked up. Different from what? Different from every recorded spiral event before it. For the first time, his voice carried something close to gravity. Not fear. But recognition. The larger the connected system, he said, the more possible decisions exist. Michael leaned back slightly. So the line is not waiting for one person. The stranger met his eyes. It may be waiting for whichever choice reaches the pressure first. The sentence settled heavily in the room. Eleanor looked toward the map again. That meant the network was no longer just waiting to identify the next observer. It was trying to understand which decision, in which system, in which place, might become the one that redirected the pressure field before it hardened into crisis. Michael spoke slowly. So we are not looking for the center of the spiral anymore. No, the stranger said. You are looking for the earliest point of influence. Eleanor whispered the phrase to herself. The earliest point of influence. That was exactly what the historical records had never allowed observers to see. Jonathan Hale had written after the course change. Harold Bennett had understood after the storm divided. Kenji Tanaka had recognized the significance only after the train delay corrected the system. But now the network stood before the moment, not behind it. And that changed the moral weight of observation. Eleanor walked back to the map and placed small marks along the decision line where the largest system intersections occurred. A major freight junction in Kansas City. A power redistribution hub near Oklahoma. Dense aviation corridor overlap above Colorado and Nebraska. A weather pressure band stretching east from the Rockies. Then she stepped back. Too many possibilities. Michael nodded. For now. The archive computer chimed again. A new message had arrived from Sofia Alvarez in Buenos Aires. Eleanor opened it quickly. The subject line read, "Grid response patterns following observer alerts." Michael moved closer. Sofia's message was precise, analytical, and unsettling. She had reviewed the timing of the recent grid fluctuation in relation to the moment she stopped to examine it manually. According to her analysis, the automated correction had occurred seconds earlier than the projected model suggested. She had no explanation. But she included one sentence at the end that made both Michael and Eleanor go still. "It is as if the system corrected sooner once I was paying attention to it." Michael read it twice. Then a third time. Eleanor looked toward the stranger. "That is impossible." The stranger did not answer immediately. Instead he asked, "Is it?" Michael frowned. "You think attention itself can change redistribution timing?" The stranger spoke carefully now, as if choosing each word with unusual precision. "Attention changes decisions. Decisions change pressure. Pressure changes timing." Eleanor looked back at Sofia's message. So the system did not respond to her thoughts. "No," the stranger said. "It responded to the decision chain that began when she noticed." Michael understood at once. The moment Sofia paused to verify the imbalance, she may have changed the timing of a manual review, which changed a sequence, which moved the correction point earlier. Nothing supernatural. Nothing irrational. Just awareness entering the system before the model expected it. He exhaled slowly. "Then the network does not control the spiral." "No," said the stranger. "But it changes what becomes possible." Eleanor turned back toward the map. And now the question they had both been avoiding finally became unavoidable. "If we see the line clearly enough," she said, "do we intervene?" Silence answered first. Because it was not a technical question. It was a moral one. The stranger looked at the spiral, then at the line crossing it. Finally he said, quietly and without ceremony, "The spiral does not choose the future." Michael lifted his head. The stranger finished the sentence. "People do." No one spoke after that. Outside, Pine Ridge remained a small, quiet town beneath an ordinary sky. But inside the archive, the silent network had crossed into new territory. For the first time in history, the observers were no longer asking only what the spiral meant. They were asking whether they had a responsibility to act before it closed. And somewhere along the decision line, pressure was still gathering. Waiting. Not for fate. For choice. For a long moment after the stranger said that people choose the future, no one inside the Pine Ridge archive moved. The sentence remained in the room like a line drawn across still water. Not dramatic. Not loud. But impossible to ignore once it had been spoken. Michael Carter stood beside the desk with Sofia Alvarez's message still open on the computer screen. Eleanor Hayes remained near the wall map, staring at the decision line crossing the center of the United States. The stranger had not raised his voice. He had not made the moment feel mystical. That was what made the statement heavier. Because it did not sound like prophecy. It sounded like responsibility. For centuries, the spiral had belonged to history. Observers found it in journals. In weather notes. In engineering records. In flight reports. The pattern was unsettling, but it carried a certain comfort. What had already happened. Records could preserve it. Understanding could honor it. But the present was different. The line on the map was still active. The systems along it were still building pressure. And the network now knew enough to recognize that the next major redistribution had not yet arrived. Eleanor finally broke the silence. If we intervene, we stop being archivists. Michael looked toward her. You were never only an archivist. Eleanor shook her head slightly. That is not what I mean. She turned fully toward him now. For 250 years, observers wrote down the moment after it happened. They saw. They recorded. They noticed the shape of balance. She looked back at the spiral. But they did not try to steer it. Michael understood the distinction immediately. Pilots lived with that distinction every day. Reading a weather system was one thing. Changing a route because of it was another. And once you changed course, you became part of the event you had observed. He spoke carefully. That has always been true. Eleanor frowned. What do you mean? Michael stepped toward the map. Jonathan Hale did not only observe. He recommended a course change. He pointed to the Atlantic record. Harold Bennett did not only observe. He altered a flight path. Then to Pine Ridge. The farmer. In 1873 did not only witness the storm. He offered shelter. That decision shifted what happened next. Eleanor stared at him for a few seconds. Then she looked toward the older records on the desk. He was right. The observers had never been passive. They had simply lacked the wider context to understand what role they had played. The stranger nodded faintly. Observation has always contained decision. That line settled differently. Not as an argument. As a correction. Eleanor exhaled slowly. So the difference is not whether observers intervene. The stranger said nothing. Michael answered instead. The difference is whether they know they are intervening. Silence followed that. Because the statement was both simple and destabilizing. For centuries, the observers had acted inside their own narrow frames. A ship captain listened to a navigator. An engineer halted a work crew. A pilot adjusted course. A rail operator delayed departure. They were not trying to influence the spiral. They were simply responding to a pressure they could feel, measure, or sense. But now the silent network had something none of them had ever possessed. Context. Global context. Historical context. The ability to see the pattern before the event closed. Eleanor walked back toward the desk and rested both hands on its edge. That makes intervention different. Michael nodded. Yes. Because now we would be choosing with knowledge. The stranger finally spoke. And knowledge changes the weight of a choice. The archive clock ticked once, then again. Outside, the town remained quiet. A passing car moved through the courthouse square and disappeared. The ordinary world continued. But inside the archive the moral line had shifted. Michael turned back to Sophia's message. It is as if the system corrected sooner once I was paying attention to it. He read it again. Then he said what had been forming in his mind since part 2. We need to know whether observer attention is changing timing consistently or incidentally. Eleanor looked at him. You mean whether the network itself is influencing how the spiral closes? Yes. The stranger watched him closely. Michael continued. If attention changes decisions, and decisions change timing, then the network may already be part of the redistribution. Eleanor understood immediately. Meaning we are not deciding whether to intervene. She looked toward the spiral. We may already be intervening simply by connecting. Michael did not answer because the thought itself was answer enough. The map on the wall, the calls from Rotterdam and Osaka, the records from Buenos Aires, the prediction in the Western Pacific, all of it had changed how observers were behaving. More attention. Earlier recognition. Faster reporting. The network had already altered the landscape of possible decisions. At that exact moment, the archive phone rang. All three of them turned toward it. Michael reached it first. Pine Ridge Archive. The voice on the other end sounded strained, focused, and hurried. "This is Melissa Grant, Regional Freight Coordination, Kansas City Corridor." Eleanor's eyes moved instantly to the decision line on the map. Kansas City. One of the largest intersections she had marked only minutes earlier. Michael kept his tone calm. "What did you notice?" Melissa answered without hesitation. "Stacking pressure across rail and trucking schedules. Dispatch software says it is manageable, but the corridor timing feels wrong." Michael closed his eyes for the briefest instant. The same language again. Pressure feels wrong. Different system. Same intuition. He asked the next question. "Did you draw anything beside the report?" The line went quiet for half a second. Then she said, almost reluctantly, "Yes." Michael waited. A spiral. Eleanor had already reached the map. She placed another pin directly on the decision line. Kansas City. Another observer. Another pressure point. But this one felt different from the others. Not because the symbol had changed. Because of where it had appeared. Not at the edge of the spiral. At the place where multiple systems crossed. Michael put the call on speaker so Eleanor could hear. "Melissa, tell us exactly what is happening." Her explanation came quickly. Freight trains were arriving slightly off sequence. Truck dispatch routing was compensating around weather delays farther west. A regional power load fluctuation had forced one distribution center to slow automated loading by several minutes. None of the issues alone were severe. Together, however, they were beginning to stack timing pressure across the corridor. Eleanor listened with growing unease. It sounded exactly like what Michael had warned about. Not one failing system. Several slightly imbalanced systems interacting at once. The decision line. Melissa continued. "I flagged the corridor for manual review. No one else seems worried yet. The software thinks everything will correct by itself." Michael asked quietly, "And do you believe that?" A pause. Then the answer. "No." The single word carried more weight than any alarm would have. Melissa was an observer whether she understood the term or not. She could feel the pressure before the models acknowledged it. Michael looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at the stranger. For the first time since the global spiral became visible, a true decision point was no longer theoretical. It had a place. It had a voice. And it had not happened yet. Michael returned to the speaker. "Melissa, do not change anything else until we understand the corridor better. But stay on the line with us." "All right," she said. After a brief pause she added, "Who exactly is us?" Michael looked toward the wall where the spiral curved across oceans and continents. Then he answered with quiet honesty. "The people who have seen this before." When the call ended a few minutes later, the archive fell silent again. But now the silence was no longer full of possibility alone. It held urgency. Eleanor stepped back from the map. "The decision line is real." Michael nodded. "And the first active observer on it has appeared." The stranger stood near the window, motionless. Finally, Eleanor asked the question neither she nor Michael could avoid anymore. "If the corridor begins to fail, do we tell her to act?" No one answered immediately. Because the question had crossed the final boundary between history and choice. The spiral had always recorded the moment when balance changed direction. Now, for the first time, the observers were standing before that moment with enough awareness to possibly influence it. And somewhere along the freight corridors, power grids, truck routes, and weather bands of the central United States, pressure was still building. Waiting. Not for discovery. For decision. For several seconds after Eleanor asked whether they should tell Melissa Grant to act, the room held a kind of stillness that felt heavier than silence. The Pine Ridge Archive had always been a place where consequences arrived already finished. A storm report had been filed. A journal entry had been written. A railway incident had been avoided and later explained in careful handwriting. Even the earliest spiral records carried a certain distance. They spoke from the far side of the event. But now that distance was gone. Kansas City was not history. It was present tense. Freight corridors were still moving. Truck routes were still updating. Power loads were still balancing and rebalancing. Weather systems were still pressing from the west. And somewhere inside that layered pressure field, one observer had already recognized the imbalance before the software, before the models, and before any official alarm had been raised. Michael Carter looked at the map, then at Melissa's name written beside the fresh pin on the decision line. "If we say nothing," he said quietly, "that is still a decision." Eleanor knew he was right. The old comfort of neutrality had disappeared the moment the network learned to see the spiral before it closed. The stranger stood near the window, watching neither of them with judgment, only with that same unsettling patience he seemed to carry through every appearance. Eleanor turned toward him. "You knew this would happen." The stranger answered calmly. "I knew the question would come. Have observers faced this before?" The stranger took a moment before replying. "Not like this." Michael folded his arms. "Meaning?" For most of history, observers acted inside their own small frame. A ship. A bridge. A train. A storm cell. They did not know they were part of a wider pattern. They responded to what they could see. Eleanor looked toward the spiral map again. "And now we can see more." "Yes," the stranger said. "Enough more that choosing not to act becomes harder to defend." The statement was plain, almost gentle, but it landed with force. Michael stepped to the desk and opened a blank page in his notebook. "Then we stop talking about philosophy and start talking about systems." Eleanor glanced at him. "You already know what you would do." "I know what pilots do when multiple pressure fields begin converging," he said. "You reduce exposure before the corridor locks." He drew a horizontal line across the page and marked the overlapping systems Melissa had described. Freight arrivals off sequence. Trucking reroutes. Power slowdown at distribution center. Weather delay moving east. Then he circled the center. The software thinks these are separate adjustments. But if they are sharing pressure through timing, one small delay could amplify the others. Eleanor moved closer. And the line would propagate. Michael nodded. Exactly. Not a dramatic collapse. A sequence. The stranger watched the sketch. Pressure rarely announces itself with spectacle first. "No," Michael said. "It usually starts by stealing margin." That sentence felt true in a way Eleanor instantly recognized. Archives were full of events that had looked manageable. Right until they were not. A bridge with one more day of strain. A river with one more inch of rain. A storm with one more degree of heat. Margin disappears quietly. Then everything depends on timing. Eleanor looked at the desk where Sofia Alvarez's note still remained open on the computer. "It is as if the system corrected sooner once I was paying attention to it." "What if attention is already changing timing inside the Kansas City corridor?" she asked. Michael considered the question carefully. Then the right recommendation might not be something large. The stranger nodded faintly. Large actions often arrive too late. Eleanor looked between them. "So we are looking for a small recommendation with system-level consequences." Michael smiled without humor. "That sounds familiar." It did. Jonathan Hale had not turned a ship around. He suggested 4 degrees south. Kenji Tanaka had not shut down a rail yard. He delayed a departure for 12 seconds. Harold Bennett had not abandoned a route. He requested a small deviation. The spiral rarely hinged on sweeping control. It bent around precise choices made at the right moment. Michael reached for the archive phone. We need Melissa back. Eleanor nodded, already moving toward the receiver. A moment later the line connected. Melissa Grant answered on the second ring, her voice tighter than before. I am here. Michael spoke first. Melissa, we need a better picture of the corridor. Are the timing pressures concentrated in one dispatch chain or spread across the whole network? She exhaled softly, as if relieved that someone was finally asking the right question. Mostly one chain. Intermodal transfer between westbound freight and regional trucking. But the strain is moving outward. How much margin do you still have? Michael asked. Another pause. Not much. Maybe 20 minutes before the routing software starts making aggressive corrections. Eleanor closed her eyes briefly. Aggressive corrections. That was exactly the kind of system behavior the spiral tended to mark afterward in records. By the time systems corrected aggressively, human choices were already being cornered by time. Michael asked another question. If you had full discretion for one small manual action, what would it be? Melissa did not hesitate. I would slow the westbound handoff by 6 minutes. Eleanor opened her eyes and looked at Michael immediately. He was already nodding. Why 6? Melissa answered with the confidence of someone who knew her. System deeply. Less than that and the downstream timing pressure stays hidden. More than that and the software compensates too hard. 6 gives the corridor room to breathe. The phrase room to breathe echoed in Eleanor's mind. That was what every historic spiral decision had done in its own way. It had created room inside a system long enough for pressure to move differently. Michael covered the receiver for a moment and turned to Eleanor. That is it. She understood. A small delay. Not dramatic. Not enough to trigger a chain of overcorrection. Just enough to widen margin. The stranger said nothing, but his expression made it clear that he saw the same thing. Michael lowered his hand from the receiver. Melissa, if you had to justify that action officially, could you? Not cleanly, she said. Not yet. Eleanor spoke now, careful and clear. But professionally, do you believe it is the right decision? Melissa's answer came quietly. Yes. The word hung in the room. This was the line. Not the one on the map. The one between observing and recommending. Michael looked toward the stranger. The stranger held his gaze and said only, the spiral does not need certainty. It needs attention at the right moment. Eleanor felt the decision settle before either she or Michael spoke it. She leaned toward the receiver. Melissa, we cannot make the choice for you. A beat of silence. Then Eleanor continued. But based on everything we are seeing, if you believe 6 minutes restores margin without forcing overcorrection, then that is the action we would take. Michael added, small enough to create breathing room. Early enough to matter. The line was quiet for half a second. Then Melissa said, all right. No drama. No declaration. No sense that history had just been invited to change direction. Only a competent professional making a measured decision inside a pressured system. But the moment landed through the archive like a current. Michael asked, call us back the moment you know what happens. I will, Melissa said. The line clicked off. No one spoke. The archive seemed to listen with them. Outside, Pine Ridge remained ordinary. A truck passed beyond the square. The courthouse lights threw long pale reflections across the windows. But inside the room, the silent network had done something no network of observers had ever done before. It had not merely recognized a spiral. It had recommended a decision before the redistribution closed. Eleanor looked at the map. Kansas City sat on the decision line like a held breath. Now we wait, she said. Michael shook his head gently. No. He looked at the spiral. Now the world decides whether that was the moment. The stranger stood near the window, almost in shadow again. For a long moment he said nothing. Then, very softly, "This is how a line becomes a history." And somewhere beyond Pine Ridge, inside freight yards and truck routes and timing software and weather bands moving across the central United States, 6 minutes of margin had just entered the system. Waiting is different when a person believes nothing can be changed. It becomes almost passive. A kind of surrender to whatever is coming. But waiting after a decision has been made is something else entirely. It is active. Every second carries consequence. Every minute feels like part of the event itself. Inside the Pine Ridge archive, no one tried to pretend otherwise. Michael Carter stood near the wall map, his eyes moving again and again between Kansas City and the surrounding points along the decision line. Eleanor Hayes remained by the desk with the ledger open to a fresh page, pen resting in her hand but not yet touching the paper. The stranger had resumed his place near the window, facing the courthouse square, as if he were listening for something that would never arrive as sound. 10 minutes passed. Then 12. The archive clock became louder than usual, each tick a reminder that pressure and time were moving together somewhere far beyond the quiet town. Michael finally spoke. "If Melissa's change was too small, the software will hide the strain and pass it downstream." Eleanor nodded. "And if it was too large, the corridor will overcorrect." "Yes. But if it was right," Michael said, "the system widens just enough to absorb the pressure without forcing a cascade." The stranger looked toward them. "And what would that mean?" Eleanor answered first. "It would mean the redistribution happens earlier and more gently." Michael added, "Which means the spiral still closes. But not the same way." That idea seemed to change the room. For 2.5 centuries, records had described moments where disaster changed direction. Storms split. Floods diverted. Routes shifted. But perhaps the deeper truth had always been this: the spiral did not only mark avoidance. It marked the manner of correction. Sometimes abrupt. Sometimes narrow. Sometimes costly. Sometimes almost graceful. The phone rang. All three of them moved at once. Eleanor picked it up. "This is Pine Ridge." Melissa Grant did not sound panicked. She sounded focused, which was somehow even more important. "I made the 6-minute adjustment." Eleanor met Michael's eyes. "What happened?" Melissa took a breath. "The corridor did not seize." Michael stepped closer. "Go on." The trucking delay absorbed into the handoff window. One of the westbound rail sequences slipped, but only slightly. That released the pressure on the loading center before the software initiated hard rerouting. Michael closed his eyes briefly. "No cascade." "Not yet." Melissa continued. "And the weather delay out west still hit the network, but by then the corridor had enough margin to spread it. It never stacked hard." Eleanor felt the relief before she allowed herself to name it. The system had bent. Not broken. Michael asked the question that mattered most. Would it have gone differently without the 6 minutes? A longer pause this time. When Melissa answered, her voice was quieter. Yes. She did not sound dramatic. She sounded certain. The software would have compressed the timing windows and forced a chain of corrections. Not a catastrophe. But a multi-system jam. Rail, trucking, warehouse power load, maybe even regional routing. It would have rippled. Eleanor looked down at the blank page of the ledger. A ripple. That was what the old records rarely captured directly. Not only what was avoided, but what kind of sequence had been prevented from hardening. Michael said, "And now?" Melissa let out a breath that sounded almost like someone setting down a weight. "Now the pressure is bleeding off. The corridor is stable." The line stayed quiet for a second. Then Melissa added, a little uncertainly, "I do not know who you people are." Eleanor smiled faintly despite everything. "Neither do we. Not completely. Melissa gave a small, tired laugh. Well. Whatever this is, it helped. After the call ended, no one spoke immediately. Eleanor set the receiver down with unusual care. Then she looked at the page in the ledger. The pen in her hand felt heavier than before because she understood that whatever she wrote next would not simply describe an event. It would define a threshold. Michael watched the map. Something subtle had changed in the room, though the pins remained in place. The line still crossed the continent. The spiral still wrapped the globe. Yet the pressure inside the pattern felt different now. Not gone. Repositioned. The stranger finally stepped away from the window. It bent, he said quietly. Michael nodded. The line bent. Eleanor wrote the date first. Then, slowly, she began the entry. Kansas City Corridor. Timing pressure accumulated across freight, trucking, weather delay, and regional power load. Observer identified earliest point of influence. Manual 6-minute adjustment widened margin. Redistribution occurred without cascade. She paused. Then added the names. Melissa Grant. Silent network present. Michael looked over her shoulder. For the first time, the network did not only recognize the spiral. Eleanor finished the thought. It helped shape how it closed. The stranger said nothing, but this time silence felt like agreement. Eleanor drew the spiral beside the entry. Then she stopped. The symbol she added was not quite like the others. Not because it changed dramatically. Because the outer curve widened slightly before returning inward. She stared at it. Michael noticed immediately. What is it? Eleanor turned the ledger so he could see. The shape. He leaned closer. The difference was subtle but real. The spiral still held the same geometry, but the outer line carried more room, more distance, more margin before the turn. Michael whispered, "It changed." The stranger looked at the page and nodded once. When the line bends early, the spiral remembers. A shiver moved through Eleanor, though the room was not cold. Not because the statement sounded mystical. Because it sounded exact. Records change when events change. The symbol had always been a record of pattern. Now the pattern itself had widened. Michael walked back to the wall map. Kansas City still marked the decision line, but the pressure around it no longer felt like a held breath. Instead it felt like the moment after turbulence when an aircraft enters cleaner air and the cabin does not yet realize the danger has passed. He traced the broader curve with his finger. So this is what happens when the network sees the line before it locks. The stranger answered, this is what happens when attention reaches the system in time. Eleanor closed the ledger, but not before looking once more at the altered spiral. For 2 centuries and more, observers had inherited records of what happened after balance returned. Tonight, that inheritance changed. The silent network had not controlled the future. It had not erased pressure. It had not eliminated consequence. It had done something smaller and perhaps more important. It had widened margin at the right moment. It had given a pressured system one better path to choose. Outside, dawn had not yet come, but the darkness was thinning. A faint line of early light sat low beyond the courthouse buildings. Pine Ridge remained quiet. The bakery would open in a few hours. Delivery trucks would move again. Most of the town would never know that, in the middle of the night, a corridor hundreds of miles away had bent instead of cascading. But the archive knew. The map knew. The ledger knew. And now the silent network knew too. Michael slipped Harold Bennett's compass back into his bag. For the first time since arriving in Pine Ridge, he did not feel like a pilot who had wandered into a pattern. He felt like part of a line of observers that had finally crossed from memory into responsibility. Eleanor looked at him. This changes everything. He nodded. Yes. The stranger opened the archive door. Cool early air drifted into the room. Before stepping outside, he looked back once, not at the people, but at the wall map and the ledger lying beside it. Then he said the sentence that would remain with both of them long after he disappeared into the paling dark. The first time a line bends, history learns a new shape. Then he was gone. No sound but footsteps fading across the square. No explanation. None needed. Because the meaning was already written in the room. The spiral had become visible. The line had bent. And the silent network had crossed from witnessing into consequence. In forgotten places, where wind carries memory and silence watches patiently, justice does not shout. It whispers. And every act leaves an echo. You have been listening to whispers of reckoning. The spiral was never only the mark of pressure. It was the mark of attention arriving in time. And when the line bends before the system breaks, history remembers the shape of that choice. Pressure gathers. Until someone listens. And every act leaves an echo.